Sarah's hands trembled as she counted the crumpled bills for the third time, her heart sinking with each recount. $18.47. That was all that stood between her family and complete destitution. The fluorescent lights of the grocery store buzzed overhead like angry wasps, and every item in her cart suddenly felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Her 3-year-old daughter Emma tugged at her worn jeans, asking in that innocent voice that could break mountains, "Mommy, why are you crying?" The weight of failure pressed against Sarah's chest like a physical thing. 6 months since her husband's accident, 6 months since the medical bills started piling up like autumn leaves, and here she was, a college-educated woman reduced to choosing between milk and bread. She wiped her eyes quickly, forcing a smile for Emma's sake, but inside, shame burned hotter than summer asphalt. That's when it happened. A small hand tugged as her sweater rang, not Emma's, but another child's. Sarah looked down to find a girl, maybe 7 years old, with tangled brown hair and eyes that seemed far too old for her face. The child wore clothes that had seen better days, hand-me-downs that spoke of their own struggles, yet she smiled with the kind of radiance that could light up December nights. "Excuse me, lady," the little girl whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I'm supposed to give you this." She pressed a folded piece of paper into Sarah's palm and scurried away before Sarah could respond, disappearing between the aisles like a guardian angel on a secret mission. Sarah unfolded the note with trembling fingers. Written in careful, childish handwriting were the words, "God sees you trying. You're doing great, Mama. Don't give up. A friend who cares." The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. Not tears of despair this time, but something else entirely, a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment that left her breathless. She looked around frantically for the little messenger, but the child had vanished. Instead, her eyes met those of a man standing in line behind her, someone she hadn't noticed before. He was older, maybe in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. His clothes were simple but clean, and when he smiled at her, deep lines crinkled around his eyes like well-worn maps of kindness. "Beautiful handwriting for such a young child," he said softly, nodding toward the note still clutched in Sarah's hand. "You saw her give this to me?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man's smile deepened. "I've been watching that little act of courage for about 20 minutes now. That's my granddaughter, Lucy. She's been standing over there by the cereal, working up the nerve to approach you ever since we got in line." Sarah's confusion must have shown on her face because the man continued, "You see, Lucy has what some folks might call a gift. She notices people who are hurting, and she insists on doing something about it. Last week, she made me drive across town to deliver cookies to a woman she saw crying at the bus stop." But how did she know? Sarah started, then stopped, looking down at her cart with new eyes. The generic brands, the careful calculations, the way she'd been standing there counting and recounting her money. It must have been obvious to anyone paying attention. "Children see things we adults miss," the old man said gently. "They haven't learned yet to look away from pain." Ma, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly piped up, "Mommy, are we poor?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, and Sarah felt that familiar stab of shame. But the old man knelt down to Emma's level, his movements careful and deliberate. "You know what, sweetheart?" he said to Emma, his voice warm as hot chocolate. "Rich and poor aren't about money in your pocket, they're about love in your heart. And looking at your mama here, I'd say you're the richest family in this whole store." He stood up and looked directly at Sarah. "My name is Frank Morrison. I've been coming to this store every Tuesday for 15 years, ever since my wife passed. I know the manager, the cashiers, most of the regular customers, and I've never seen anyone handle a difficult situation with as much grace and dignity as you're showing right now." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "Grace? I'm falling apart." "No," Frank said firmly. "You're holding together." "There's a difference." My Lucy saw it, and frankly, so did I. Before Sarah could respond, Frank had moved up the front of her cart and begun pushing it toward the checkout line. "Come on," he said. "Let's get your groceries rung up." "Sir, I can't afford this," Sarah began, but Frank held up a gentle hand. "The note my granddaughter wrote, she didn't come up with those words on her own. I may have helped with the spelling, but the sentiment was all hers. And when a 7-year-old sees someone who needs help and decides to act on it, well, it reminds an old man of his responsibilities too. At checkout, Frank quietly handed his credit card to the cashier before Sarah could protest. The total was $127.43, say more than 6 times what Sarah had in her pocket. She watched in stunned silence as Frank paid without hesitation, as if buying groceries for strangers was something he did every Tuesday. "I can't accept this," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face again. Frank turned to her, and in his eyes, she saw something that took her breath away, not pity, but recognition. One human being truly seeing another. 37 years ago, he said quietly, I was standing in a grocery store much like this one. I had 2 babies at home, had just lost my job, and was trying to figure out how to stretch $12 into a week's worth of meals. A stranger paid for my groceries that day, told me the only payment he wanted was for me to help someone else when I could. He handed Sarah the receipt. I've been looking for the right someone for decades. Thank you for letting it be you. As they walked toward the parking lot, Emma skipping between them, Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest. The shame was still there, but it was being crowded out by something warmer, something that felt dangerously like hope. Why did your granddaughter really write that note? Sarah asked as they reached her car. Frank smiled as Lucy came running over from where she'd been waiting by his truck. Tell her, Lucy. The little girl looked up at Sarah with those wise, old eyes. My mommy had to go to heaven when I was 5, she said matter-of-factly. Before she left, she told me that angels don't always have wings. Sometimes they just have broken hearts and not enough money. She said if I ever saw one, I should help. Sarah knelt down and pulled Lucy into a hug, this tiny stranger who had somehow seen right through to her soul. Thank you, she whispered into the child's hair. 3 months later, Sarah found herself in the same grocery store. Things were better now. She'd found work, the bills were manageable, and Emma was thriving in daycare. As she pushed her cart down the cereal aisle, she noticed a young father counting change while his toddler waited patiently in the cart. Sarah approached slowly, a folded piece of paper in her hand. Written in her own careful handwriting were the words, "You're stronger than you know. This too shall pass." Someone who's been there. The cycle of kindness, started by a 7-year-old's courage and an old man's generosity, continued its quiet revolution, one broken heart at a time.